All right, here we are with the review of the neutral cards in Journey to Ungoro, and I wanted to start off the review by going over what the adaptations are. So, whenever a card says adapt, what you're going to do is you're going to discover, you're basically going to choose from one of three randomly chosen adaptations of these 10, right? So, three of these 10 will be chosen, and you'll get to pick one of those three. Some of these adaptations are significantly better than others. Generally, the stats ones, like +3 attack, +1/+1, +3 health, even some to some extent Death Rattle, summon 2 plants, are better than a lot of the other ones. But the other ones are not horrible. And in some cases, for small creatures, things like Poisonous are very good. There's one creature for which Wind Fury is very important. Taunt can be relevant a lot of the time. There's a lot of other things that you can get here, and they're not that far off of just getting an extra +3 health, let's say, or +1/+1 of the creature. So just want to make sure that everyone was clear what the adaptations are before going into the review. I'll be kind of referring back to these adaptations and saying which ones are good or bad in certain situations. And generally, most creatures have 3 or 4 adaptations that are pretty useful for them. But it's good to know what these are. All right, so on to the cards. First up, we have Bittertide Hydra. Bittertide Hydra is very reminiscent of Fellreaver back from GVG, which was also a 5-mana 8/8. This one, I think, has a lower downside. Fellreaver was a very playable card. You needed to be in sort of an aggressive deck, but it would often just win you games. You'd play a 5-mana 8/8, your opponent wouldn't have an answer, and it didn't matter if they burned a bunch of cards from your library, which was the downside of Fellreaver. Every time you played a card, you basically milled your opponent for 3, or you burned 3 cards out of their library. You could get rid of all the cards in their library, but if you didn't have an answer to an on-curve 5-mana 8/8, they would just usually kill you in 2 or 3 turns, and it wouldn't matter that they're fatiguing, because you'd be dead. Bittertide Hydra has some particular disadvantages. The first one is that I think this meta is a lot slower, and a card like this is not as good in a slow meta. It's still a 5-mana 8/8, so it's still very strong, but the meta pushes against it a little bit. There's also a lot of small creatures in the set, and there's also poisonous creatures in the set. This card doesn't match up particularly well against a 1/2 taunt with poisonous. You just take 3 damage and you lose your big guy. But unless you're going up against Shaman, there's nothing really that blows you out in a huge way with this card. Yeah, if your opponent has a bunch of small creatures, then maybe you take 12 damage as opposed to 6 when playing this guy. But also kind of implies that they don't have a good way of clearing this if they just have to send a bunch of small minions in at this thing to be able to take it down. So there's some board states where you're not really going to want to play this, but in a lot of board states, this guy's going to be great, and he's going to close out a game pretty quickly. And if you're an aggressive deck, you're not going to care that your own life total is lost because you're going to be killing your opponent before they kill you, right? Your life total is not a resource that you need to value all that highly when you're the beatdown, when you're the aggressor. The one class that you really can't play this card against is Shaman. Most Shamans, almost all Shamans, are going to have somewhere in their deck a Volcano, and if they play Volcano with a Bittertide Hydra on the board, you're going to take 24 damage and your Hydra's going to die, and you're probably just going to lose the game on the spot. So this card does have one big thing that is really against it in this meta, which is that Volcano is a card with a pretty high offering rate. But if you're playing against Shaman, perhaps you just don't play this card, or you wait until they play a Volcano and you have an idea that their hand is clear, the coast is clear, and then you play this guy. You could play this on turn 10, and it's perfectly fine. It's still an 8/8. It's still going to be relevant later in the game. You can play around a lot of things, wait for them to use up their resources, and make sure the coast is clear. But yeah, there is that one danger playing against Shaman, where I think a lot of times you're just going to want to hold this in hand unless you're kind of in a position where this needs to win you the game, otherwise you can't win. But I think that's fine. Shamans aren't the most popular class on the ladder or in the arena. You'll have a decent time. They're a very popular class on the ladder usually, but they aren't that common in arena. And most of the other classes don't have great ways of dealing with this oftentimes. I do think you want to be in a more aggressive deck. And to me, the way the meta is shaping out, I think Rogue is one of the more strong classes that has this sort of aggressive bent. So it's going to have higher value, I think, in Rogue lists. But it's still very strong overall. I wouldn't even mind playing this in a slower deck, just as a big creature that can potentially close out a game, right? This is a good top deck. It's good on turn 5. Very solid card overall. I'm going to pick it very highly. Blaze Caller. Blaze Caller is one of these big payoffs for having a bunch of elementals in your deck. I think that the classes that are going to be most interested in doing a lot of this elemental playing are going to be Mage and Shaman, and the other one's really not so much. I'm not even sure if Priest really likes elementals all that much, though they do have some elemental stuff going on. I think Mage and Shaman are the two classes that are going to be making the most use of elementals, and I think in those classes this card is very, very big. I think this is a great card to have. You're going to pick it almost every time it's offered to you. Of course, the downside is if you don't have elementals, it's just a 7 mana 6/6, right? Which is not a good rate. War Golem isn't a particularly great card, and it's a 7/7 for 7 mana. Unless you're getting the Battle Cry, this card isn't very good. But when you're in one of these classes that does have a lot of elemental synergy, you're going to be able to get a lot of elementals. A lot of the elementals are pretty strong, and this card, is, after being enabled with those elementals in your deck, is also going to be very strong. So there's a lot of synergy going on here, and this card is part of the top end of that synergy. I think if you're in Mage and Shaman, you pick this very highly, right? This is going to be tier 1 material for you. If you're not in one of those classes, it probably isn't tier 1 material for you, but it's possible you pick this up and then later on you pick up like Firefly or something that's going to help you get there with elementals, and then this card becomes playable. I think this card is pretty decent. I think you're going to pick it tier 1 as, this is going to be the card that you pick most of the time when you're Mage or Shaman. And if you're another class, maybe you pick this depending upon where else you got with the elementals. Bright-Eyed Scout. This card's very good. It's a 4-mana 3/4 that draws you a card, which is a good rate. I mean, Gnomish Inventor is a 2/4 for 4 that draws you a card. And arguably, this change its cost to 5 clause can be an upside, right? If the card's cost was, say, 8, and you change it to 5, that's a great deal for you. And I think that given that the meta is a little bit slower, I think that more often than not, you're going to be able to get away with playing slower decks that have cards that cost more than 5, and this is not going to be a drawback. And even if it is a drawback, it's not the biggest of deals, because sometimes on turn 5, you'll play, if you drew a card that costs 3, you might end up playing that card on turn 5 and just not playing your hero power, versus, say, if you had that card and it still cost its normal amount, all you would have gotten was an extra hero power out of the deal. In any case, a 4-mana 3/4 that draws you a card is almost always going to be good. I think this card is no exception. I'm going to pick this pretty highly. I think that there aren't a lot of cards I'm going to take over it, although we did just see 2 previously that were also epics that are the sort of cards that would be offered to you as well alongside this card that you'd have to kind of choose from. But a lot of the class epics, a lot of the things that you're going to be offered in the epic slot aren't actually that good. This is kind of really the expansion that's changed that and introduced a lot of good epics. So sometimes this card is just going to be the slam dunk pick because your other epics are not going to be good. I think this card is solid. I think that the downside in this meta is not going to be that much of a downside. I'm going to value this pretty highly. Charge Devilsaur, yet another epic. It's an 8-mana 7/7 with kind of pseudo charge. The way that Blizzard is working around these issues of charge, just closing out games without having any sort of board state or building up any sort of board, is they make it so that the charge creature can't attack on the turn that it's played. This is sort of the fixed charge, and this is still pretty good. 8-mana 7/7 with charge is good. In Arena, a lot more so than in Constructed, you care about the board state, that you're going to win a lot of games by clearing your opponent's board and then beating down, right? There's a lot of really aggressive board clearing in Arena that you don't really see in Constructed. A lot of Constructed players will just be going face again and again and again. And to some extent, Arena was like that, 6 months ago, a year ago, when we were kind of in curve stone, as people call it, where it was just you play your stuff on curve and you go face and you win. But I think we're back to a very value-centric Arena, and cards like this are pretty strong because they come down, they're big creatures, and they impact the board the turn that they come down. And that's usually the formula for a pretty successful creature in Arena. 7/7 isn't the greatest rate, of course, for an 8-drop. You could be getting like an 8-10 if you were just following sort of vanilla stats. It'd be around there. But still, the charge aspect, even if it can't go face the turn that's played, is really big. It helps you solve a lot of board states. This guy's also very strong, continuing sort of the slew of very strong epics in this set. Devilsaur Egg. This one's sort of the first stinker that we've hit. This is more or less, if you remember Nerubian Egg from Naxxramas, this is kind of like Nerubian Egg. Nerubian Egg was a 2-mana 0/2 that when it died summoned a 4/4. This one costs 1 extra mana. It gets 1 point extra of health, which is irrelevant because you want this to die anyways. But it gives you a 5/5. It's still pretty bad. I think the only class that is really at all interested in this is Warlock, because Warlock has, I think at common, a card that has a battle cry, sacrifice a creature, adapt twice. That's a pretty big deal. If this is how you're curving out, you're playing this card and then you're playing that creature and adapting twice, that's very strong. Other than that, though, this card is just not very good. You need some way to give it taunt or buff it to have it really any impact at all. Developing that sort of synergy is pretty hard. I think you pass on this card almost always and find something better. This is something you're not going to be happy putting in your deck, I think. Egg Napper. This card's great. One way to think about this is sort of like a 5/3 for 3 mana, which is a very good rate. 4/3 is the usual. It's a little bit backloaded in terms of the stats because it's Death Rattle, and you're still at the end of the day just getting a bunch of 1 health stuff, which is kind of vulnerable to a lot of the board clears. But this card is a sort of sticky minion that is reminiscent of Naxxramas that was very strong, and I think you're going to pick this pretty highly. I think that I'm not sure if you'd count this as a tier 1 common. It kind of varies a little bit depending upon what class you're talking about, but a lot of classes are going to look at this as a tier 1 common. That they're going to want to fill up their 3-drop slots with things like this. And I think he's a very solid creature. I'm going to pick him very highly in most classes, and he fits pretty much any strategy, right? I mean, he's a sticky minion, so he works very well when you're not on the board, right? This is a way of helping establish yourself on the board against an opponent who has board control, because it's hard for them to clear all that stuff efficiently. It's also not that bad when you're ahead, because it's some insurance against board control, and the initial body with having 3 attack is pretty aggressive, right? So the fact that it's kind of like this effective 5/3 and has a lot of attack versus defense makes it good on offense. The fact that it's sticky makes it pretty good for you when you're just trying to grab the board. This guy's just great all around. Very flexible pick. I would take this pretty highly over a lot of other stuff. Elise the Trailblazer. I think this might be the best legendary in the set. A lot of people who reviewed this set didn't really understand what it meant to shuffle a sealed Un'Goro pack into your deck. It shuffles a card that costs 2 mana that basically draws you 5 cards. All right, it's not like it's like a Prince Malchezaar type effect. It's not one of those where he just puts 5 random cards into your deck. Here, you get a card that is a 2 mana draw 5. And 2 mana draw 5 is pretty insane. And I think there's also some slight bias in the stats of those packs, so to speak, that you're shuffling into your deck. That they're more likely to have legendaries, which is pretty nice. And it's an Un'Goro pack, and Un'Goro, I think, is a fairly strong expansion. That's my view of it. So I think that at least a Trailblazer, 5/5 for 5 is a good rate, right? It's not that far off of Pit Keeper, which is kind of the vanilla standard, right? Which is 5/6 for 5. I think this card is very strong, very, very, very highly rated legendary. Probably the best legendary of this set for Arena, at least among the neutral cards. Emerald Hive Queen. A lot of people reviewing this set have been pretty low on this card. I've seen this put as like below average or average. Some people put it really far down. I think a 1 mana 2/3, no matter what the downside, is still going to be pretty relevant. When you play this on turn 1, a lot of time you're just going to be trading off whatever your opponent plays, right? You play this on turn 1, they play a 3/2, you trade this into it, and it's as if nothing happened, right? You got to play a 2/3 for 1 mana with no downside. I think that we played with Zombie Chow before, back in the days of Naxxramas, and before they rotated everything to Wild. I think that this card is actually pretty good. That said, it is tricky in terms of how you play it because you do kind of want to have a lot of 2-drop spells, right, as opposed to minions. It does help if you have some way of kind of clearing this guy, right? Like, you have to be pretty interested in trading this guy off, I think. So it helps if you're in a less aggressive deck that isn't ideally curving out 1-drop into 2-drop into 3-drop, because this will mess up that plan pretty badly. But it's great as a defensive option. You don't need to play it turn 1. It's still going to have some relevance turn 2, turn 3. So it can be something you play once you've seen your opponent play something that you want to trade this into, right? And overall, I'm not that down on this card. I do think that you can't rate it too highly because at the end of the day, it's not the most impactful minion in the world, and this is a slower meta, so it's possible that you play your Emerald Hive Queen and just neither of you play any more creatures for the next couple turns, right? And this card doesn't get a whole lot of value, but I still think this card is pretty good. I think that this is at its best when you're playing a slow deck against an aggressive deck, right? It's not going to be that relevant in a slow deck versus slow deck, but as a slow deck against an aggressive deck, playing this and leaving up something like 2-mana removal spell, which is pretty common in, say, Mage, I think this is going to be at its best. So I actually would take this reasonably highly. I'm going to consider this like tier 2, tier 3 type material. And depending upon what my mana curve is looking like, right, this is something that can solve a lot of my early game problems, especially if I don't have a lot of 2-drops, right? If I don't have any 2-drops, this is a great 1-drop, because I'm pretty sure I'm going to be able to trade this off by the time I'm looking to play my 3-drops. I might not be able to by the time I'm looking to play my next 2-drop, but by the time I'm playing my 3-drops, I'm probably getting there, right? Or if my opponent isn't doing anything, then I'm having a good time because they aren't doing anything. I'm still getting to hit them in the face with my Emerald Hive Queen, right? I'm playing some card draw spell on turn 3, and I'm still having a good time. So I think this card is actually a lot better than people have given it credit for. That said, it is an epic, and I've shown a lot of epics that are also very strong. So it's not quite the free pass that it would have had before, right? There still are a lot of really weak epics out there, and you're going to have picks where this just dominates them pretty easily. But there are other things that contest it. And if you run up against one of those things that contest it, then I think you have some decision-making on whether or not you take this card. I think this card depends a lot on your curve, though, and I think it definitely has a place in a lot of decks. Emerald Reaver, this card's garbage. Other card, people rated very low, and I thought it was better than that. This card is just bad. It's a 2-1 for 1, which has never really been the strongest. Like, it's a decent rate. It's kind of what you'd expect of a 1-drop, but the Battle Cry isn't really something useful, and it's not even really that great for an aggressive deck, right? Deal 1 damage to an enemy hero is not that great. Even if this were 1 mana 2-1 Battle Cry, deal 1 damage to the enemy hero, it probably still wouldn't be that great. The fact that it's a symmetrical effect isn't that good. Just in general, 1 mana 2-1s aren't the greatest in Arena. You kind of want some justification, like they have to give you some value for you to play them. This guy isn't giving you value, so I'm going to pass on him. Even if I care about synergies with beasts, I'm not into this. Just not that great of a card. I would almost never play this. Firefly. This card is unassuming. I just talked before about how a 2-1 for 1 isn't that great. It's just not really what you want to be doing in Arena. You want a card that generates value. This looks at first glance like a card that isn't really generating you that value either, right? It's a 1-2 for 1, which in many ways is worse than a 2-1 for 1, because it doesn't trade up a lot of the time. The important text here is elemental. It is an elemental itself, and it adds an elemental to your hand. And both those are pretty important because this is a lot of the glue that kind of makes your deck stick together when you're one of these elemental decks. You want to be playing elementals pretty regularly. That way you can turn on your elemental trigger cards, right? The ones that say if you've played an elemental the previous turn, then this has an additional effect. This is one of these things that you can play on turn 1 and then hold the other elemental in your hand for when you have another elemental to play, right? Or when you need to play another elemental. At a very cheap cost, it lets you set up those turns very easily without disrupting a lot of your plans. And so, though this isn't really that impressive, right? If I play 2 1-2s for 2 mana for 1 card, that isn't really that great. In classes like Mage or Shaman, I'm going to actually value this pretty highly because it's going to help me turn on all those synergies, and it isn't that bad of a card, right? Getting 2 1/2s for 2 mana off of one card is decent, right? I mean, Pantry Spider is kind of marginally playable, and it's a 3 mana get 2 1/3s. This is okay, and I'm not going to value it very highly outside of Mage or Shaman, but in Mage and Shaman, I'm gonna pick this up pretty highly. I think in Mage and Shaman this would count as a tier 1 drop. This is the sort of thing you're going to want to have in your deck. Outside of that, I really don't like it all that much. Maybe you pick this up in Priest, which also has some elemental stuff going on, but yeah, I think this is a card for mages and shamans, and you're probably ignoring this in most of the other cases and just taking some random 2-drop or whatever. Fire Plume Phoenix. This card's great. It's common and neutral, which means you're going to see a lot of it, and deals Battlecry, deal 2 damage. Yeah, this card's fantastic. This is a small removal on a stick. Obviously, 3/3 for 4 is not the greatest of rates. Could be better. But, back when a card like Keeper of the Grove, right, which is a druid card, it was a 2/4, and you got to choose between silencing or dealing 2 damage to a minion. That card was great, and you'd almost always pick it. This has roughly the similar stat line, and you don't get the silence option. Blizzard doesn't like silences as much anymore, but you still get the deal 2 damage option, which is usually what you were picking with the Keeper of the Grove. This card's great, and I think it's in a way meta-defining in the sense that this is a card that is really, I think, going to make you pick 2 3s for 2 mana over 3 2s for 2 mana. This is the card that makes you say, when I'm doing my trades, I don't want to leave a creature at 2 health. I want to leave a creature at 3 health, right? There's also a lot of 2 damage AoE clears in this set, and in sort of previous, that seems to be where Blizzard is getting comfortable having their AoE clears. So I really think most minions are going to have more than 2 points of health to really justify themselves a lot of the time, to really be a reliable body, and this card is part of the reason why. Battlecry, deal 2 damage. A lot of people are going to pick this pretty highly. You're going to see decks where they have 2, maybe 3 of these. It also is an elemental, so it has even better application in Mage and Shaman, and you're going to see a lot of mages and a decent number of shamans, well, some shamans, in Arena. So I think you should be drafting your decks expecting to face off against a guy like this, and should be expecting that on turn 4, your opponent is not going to have a very hard time dealing 2 damage to one of your minions. Frozen Crusher, another elemental, another strong elemental, which is part of the reason why I think a lot of these elemental synergies get there, is that cards like this, which are just good on their own, are also incidentally elementals. This is a 6 mana 8/8. After this minion attacks, freeze it. Yeah, I'm fine with that. For one, I could potentially silence this and get rid of the freeze as sort of a surprise. But two, even if it freezes, I'm still clearing a lot of my opponent's stuff, right? I'm going to use this to wipe a lot of my opponent's board, and they're probably going to have to still spend cards to get rid of this. They're not going to like that this card just every other turn is killing one of their creatures. I think this card is very solid. I think probably it gets its best work done in things like Priest, right? Where you're looking sort of for board control, and you want to get a big minion like this on the board, and then your opponent is really pressured to clear it. Even if it's frozen, they're going to want to clear it because every turn you're going to have the opportunity to heal it back up and get a lot of value out of your hero power. So as Priest in particular, I think this card is going to be fantastic because your opponent, even though it has this downside, your opponent is still going to want to clear it. So they're still going to have to treat this as if it's a 6 mana 8/8 with no downsides, and that's really where you want to be with this card. I think this is good in all classes regardless, though, and especially if you have the elemental synergy, it has this extra bonus. I mean, if this turns on your elementals, fantastic. I think this card is very, very highly pickable. Gentle Megasaur. Well, it's a 4 mana 5/4, and it's a beast, which has some relevance. It does have a relevant tribal, but I don't think you're really going to draft this much more highly than you drafted Lost Tall Strider. This really is just a better version of Lost Tall Strider, and Lost Tall Strider was a pretty reasonable tier 2-ish type card. And I don't think that this stat line is particularly bad. I don't think there's some reason why we say that 5-4 is necessarily a lot worse than where it was before. But still, this isn't going to be something you're going to pick very highly just because you're not going to have a lot of Murlocs no matter what you're doing, really. This is the sort of epic you pick when you're faced with a bunch of bad class epics to choose from. And you just say, all right, I'll just take the practically vanilla 5-4. If you do have Murlocs in your deck, then this has that extra bonus, but probably the synergy you care more about is this being a beast, right? This is something you like more as like a hunter or a druid. But yeah, there's not much to be said about this. It's usually just a vanilla 5-4 for 4. Giant Mastodon. This guy's pretty good. 9 mana is a lot, of course, but this is a slower meta, and Taunt is a pretty relevant keyword on a very high-costed minion, right? You might look at this and you might say, well, this is a lot worse than Bog Creeper, right? Because Bog Creeper costs 7 mana and it's a 6/8 taunt. This is only getting 2 points of health for 2 mana. That isn't that great. At the same time, this is a slower meta, and Bog Creeper is a pretty good card. I mean, we can say, oh, it isn't as good as Bog Creeper, but that's something you say honestly about most cards in this game. So the fact that this costs 2 mana more and you're only getting 2 extra health, this is still a pretty good card. I would say in any deck where you're aiming to be slower and you want kind of one of these big finisher cards, this guy's pretty solid. And I'd say borderline between tier 1 and tier 2. In more aggressive classes, this is going to be less useful. In more defensive, slower, attrition-based decks, this is going to be more useful, right? You want this more in those attrition strategies, but it's still going to be pretty good everywhere. Even as an aggressive deck, you're not going to mind having this as your top-end card, right? And in slower decks, you might have more than one of this guy. Obviously, I don't think you pick this over Bog Creeper, but that said, guy's pretty solid. 10 health is a lot to get through, and some decks are just not going to have an easy way of getting rid of this guy, and that'll just stabilize you, right? You'll play this on turn 9, and your opponent's offense will be thwarted, or they'll have to trade their entire board in to get this one Giant Mastodon, and then you play another Giant Mastodon, and they just concede. The card can have that effect, so I don't know. I would say this is borderline tier 1, tier 2. This is going to be a card you probably want in your deck more often than not, I would say. Pretty decent. The mana cost is high, but I think given the way the meta is, this is still a pretty good card. Giant Wasp. This card's great. Stealth is a pretty good keyword to have alongside Poisonous. This card is basically Patient Assassin, but an extra point of health and attack, if that's relevant. I mean, it's Poisonous, so who cares? And it costs 1 mana more. I think having the extra health is pretty relevant. There's a lot of 1 damage AoE type effects, right? Whirlwind type effects, or Twilight Flame Callers, or even someone casts like an Arcane Missiles and maybe hits this guy if he only had 1 health. So I think having the extra 1 point of health is worth an extra point of mana on a creature like this. So I think this compares reasonably well with Patient Assassin, and Patient Assassin was always a pretty decent pick. This is at common, so this is a card that I think is going to be very strong, and it's going to see a lot of play. You're going to see this in a lot of decks very frequently, and you kind of want to have some answer for this, right? This is a card that makes you value things like cleave, multi-shot, power shot. Ways of getting rid of this guy while he's stealthed are going to be pretty big, because otherwise he might just kill off whatever your 5-drop was, your 6-drop was, something like that, right? Your opponent will just hang back with it and wait for you to play something big, and then they'll kill it. This guy is sometimes just 3 damage or 3 mana kill a creature. It's a 3 mana assassinate in a lot of circumstances. So I think this card is very good. I think it's one of the top commons of the set. I think you're going to want it no matter what you're playing, right? Because if you're an aggressive strategy, this has stealth. It's potentially just 2 points of reach, which is nice. It also gets you through big taunts and things that your opponent can play, right? So it's not like it's really that bad as an aggressive creature. And as a defensive creature, it's pretty good itself, right? Because you can play this, and even if your opponent has control of the board, you're going to get to be able to decide how combat goes because it has stealth, and you're going to select some pretty good combat given this is poisonous. So top card, maybe one of the best commons in the set. You're going to draft this almost every time that it's offered to you. Glacial Shard. I wasn't very big on this card at the start. A lot of people like Grinning Goat and Hearthstone Arena rated it a lot more highly. I've come around to the point of view this is a good card, and mainly because it's an elemental, though. I really value this a lot more in Mage and Shaman, and less, although it is still pretty good, in other decks. I mean, it is a 2-1 for 1, which is not a great stat line, but the battle cry of freeze an enemy is pretty solid, right? That's an effect that's going to be pretty reasonable. This is, I guess the way you want to describe this is this is an early drop. It's a 1-drop, but that has relevance later on in the game, which is a pretty important feature. And so neither of these effects are that great on their own, right? Neither of them is really worth a card, but the fact that you're getting both of them makes it pretty good. I'm going to say that this is tier 1 material in any deck that's running elementals. I think this is still at least tier 2 in any strategy, even if it isn't running elementals, right? Because Battlecry Freeze an enemy lets you dictate a lot about how combat is going to go, and that's going to give you a lot of advantages. Even in aggressive strategies, this means you just stop your opponent from clearing one of your creatures for a turn, which is what you need to get in. Things of that sort. I'm not really too enthused with the 2-1 body, but the fact that it can get its value regardless of whether or not your opponent just pings it down the next turn is pretty important. I think this is at least tier 2 in most classes, and tier 1 in any class that's running elementals. Gluttonous Ooze. This is like Acidic Swamp Ooze's older brother, with a picture that's easier to kind of understand. A lot of people don't know what's going on with the Acidic Swamp Ooze. Look at the picture for a while. You'll see what's going on. But in any case, rather than being a 3-2 for 2 that destroys your opponent's weapon, this is a 3-3 for 3 that destroys your opponent's weapon and gives you armor equal to that weapon's attack. Which is a pretty good deal because most of the weapons that you're going to see and that you're going to want to destroy are weapons with like 3 attack, 4 attack, 5 attack, right? Things of this sort. At least they're going to have 2 attack. And if this is, 3 mana, destroy your opponent's weapon, gain 2 armor, that's great, right? That's a perfect rate. I guess the trick is that it's kind of tricky to run up against weapons because weapons don't get the same offering bonus that spells do. So that is a little bit tricky. But there's still a decent number of very popular weapon classes in Arena. You see occasionally Hunter and Shaman, but Paladin is one of the big ones, and Rogue is one of the big ones. And one of the things that also was included in this, and this is a spoiler a little bit for some of the Rogue cards that we'll see, one of the cards is a card that gives the Rogue weapon poisonous, and that's a pretty big deal, I think. If they just take their normal dagger and they give it poisonous, that means for 3 mana they get to essentially have given their weapon like plus 10 attack. I mean, it doesn't like it can't go face, but if their weapon is like a Gore Howl for 2 turns, that's a pretty big deal. Being able to destroy that type of weapon as soon as you see it is big game. And so I think there's enough relevant targets, even though weapons aren't getting the same bonus as spells. They're treated sort of like minions. I still think you'll see enough weapons that these sort of hate cards are going to be relevant. And even when you don't see it, the fact that it's a 3-3 for 3 isn't the worst of rates, right? Normally you're looking at like a 4-3 for 3, or you're looking at like a 3-4 for 3. You're only losing 1 stat, and you're getting to destroy an opponent's weapon and potentially gain armor. That's good enough upside that I'm going to consider this card solid tier 2, maybe even tier 1, depending upon how starved you are for 3 drops in a given class. Galaka Crawler. This is bad design card. Pirates are big, and so they built something that kills pirates. All right. Yeah, I think the card design is very poor, but the creature's fine. I said before that I value 2 3s more than 3 2s for 2 mana nowadays because of all the 2 damage removal that's entered into the scene. This is a 2-3 for 2, and it does have upside, both with its battle cry, which, when it's relevant, is going to be very big, right? If you play a 2 mana 3-4 that destroys your opponent's 5/4 or something like that, then that's huge game. But it also has irrelevant tribal, which is beast, and so even when this is just a 2/3, you're gonna take it as a vanilla 2/3 with beast. I mean, this is sort of just a better version of River Crocolisk, right? As long as you're not the guy with the pirate. So I don't know. I think this card is okay. You're not going to get to destroy a pirate very often, and you're not going to hold this in your hand till you see a pirate. So when you have this in your opening hand, you're going to play it on turn 2, and then if they play a pirate afterwards, it's like, oh, well, shucks, right? So you're not only unable to see many pirates when you play Arena, but you're going to have to see those pirates before it becomes time for you to drop this guy, and that's something of a tall order. So I don't think the battle cry is very relevant, at least in Arena. I don't even think it's going to be that great in Constructed just because it's such a blank against decks that aren't running Pirate. But you'll draft this as a 2/3 beast just fine, and that's not a bad rate. It's a relevant tribal. I think 2/3s are better than 3/2s. All that stuff enters into the mix. This is like a tier 2-ish type card, right? You're gonna put in your deck sometimes. Hemet, Jungle Hunter. I don't think this guy is the best legend in legend common, or it's not legend common, neutral legend in this set. I think that distinction goes to Elise. This guy's pretty good though, because a 6 mana 6/6 is not that bad of a rate, right? It's only one stat point shy of, say, Boulderfist Ogre, which is sort of the vanilla standard. And Battle Cry, destroy all cards in your deck that cost 3 or less is actually pretty good in Arena, because typically what happens in Arena is you don't want to draw your lower cost stuff later into the game, right? You want to be drawing a bunch of gas off the top of your deck, and being able to destroy all the cards that cost 3 or less is going to be pretty big. It's going to mean that you're going to be able to play like an impactful turn every turn. It means you're going to win the top deck war. I'm not really sure how well this guy will stack up against other legendaries. There are some bad legendaries, but there's also a lot of good ones. This guy is not going to beat those, but he's going to beat a lot of the mediocre legendaries. One, because a 6/6 for 6 is not bad, and also because this Battle Cry is pretty relevant in Arena. There's weird stuff you can do in Constructed, but I think just even without building your deck around this guy at all, the Battle Cry is relevant in Arena. Humongous Razor Leaf. This card's terrible. I mean, 3 mana 4/8 is fantastic, don't get me wrong, but can't attack is a pretty bad keyword. This isn't like Magic the Gathering where can't attack just means this guy can block. He can't do anything, right? Because your opponent just won't attack it. You need some way of silencing this or taunting it up or doing something, which is just not very prevalent. This card is horrible. You're not going to find the stuff to go along with it. Don't draft this card under any circumstances. I don't even care if you have a bunch of taunt giving type stuff. Don't draft this. It's just going to be so useless. Even if you have like 3 Defenders of Argus in your deck, this card still probably isn't what you're going to want to pick up. Just not a good card. This is some weird thing for Purify Priest and Constructed. I don't even know. Igneous Elemental. It's an elemental, which is a big deal. Death Rattle, it adds 2 more elementals to your hand. Not bad. Each of those cost 1 mana, so it's not like they're free or anything, but this is one of these cards you're going to pick up pretty highly, I think, if you're an elemental deck. If you're Mage or Shaman, I think you're going to draft this pretty highly, and it's possible if you're kind of getting there with elementals in one of the other classes that you end up picking up this guy too. 2/3 for 3 is not a great rate, and of course having 1/2s for 1 in your hand is not really that great either. I wouldn't even call that the equivalent of like drawing a card if the elemental stuff isn't relevant to you. But if the elemental stuff is relevant to you, this guy's great, right? He's a 3-drop that you can play on turn 3 and then still have the ability to trigger your elemental stuff the turns later. If you have an elemental you want to do on turn 4, you play this guy turn 3, right? And there are elementals you want to be playing turn 4. So you do want 3-drops that turn them on. And then you could decide, well, I don't actually want to do it on turn 4. I actually need to do this first. I need to do some different thing, right? The fact that it gives these 2 more elementals to your hand gives you that flexibility. I don't know. I'm not going to draft this very highly if I'm not one of those elemental classes. I'm gonna value this pretty highly, though, when I am one of those elemental classes. This is more often than not going to be a card that I pick up. So I think if you're an elemental class, this is like borderline tier 1, tier 2. If you're not an elemental class, it's significantly worse. I'm basically saying elemental classes are mage and shaman. I don't think priest quite gets there, but yeah, if you need elementals, this is one of the cards that you're perfectly fine picking up, kind of like Firefly, right? I'd compare this very very similarly to Firefly. Nesting Rock. This card's great. Even if you don't get the taunt, it's still good. A 5 mana 4/7 is a great rate. I mean, typically what you want to see is you want to see twice the mana cost +1 as the stats that you get for a minion. That's kind of the vanilla standard. This meets that, right? This is a Chillwind Yeti with +2 health and +1 mana cost. And if it gets taunt, that's amazing. This shuts down people who are just trying to burn you out and go face. Because if they're not dealing with your creatures on your board, this guy gets taunt and then suddenly they just lose. This also protects a lot of your stuff that you're using to go face, right? This is fine in an aggressive strategy too, because you're going to have the creatures to give this taunt, and then your opponent is going to have to chew through 7 points of toughness on this guy before he can kill off the creatures that are going after him. This card's fantastic. Pick it up very highly. Yeah, this is going to be one of your tier 1 commons, I think, in this meta. Also a beast, which is sometimes relevant. Osric. 9 mana 5/5. Has taunt, getting better. Battlecry, gain +5 health for each elemental you played last turn. Okay, well, this guy is probably going to be a 5/10 taunt, even when you kind of turn him on. That's not that great. Even if he's a 9 mana 5/15, that's good, but it's not like it was really worth a lot of the effort. I don't think this is a legendary you're going to pick up very highly. I mean, you'll need to be in elementals first off for this to be something relevant, right? So you probably want to be mage or shaman, and even then, I mean, are you really going to have so few options when you're choosing among legendaries that this guy is the one you pick? I mean, I don't think this guy is necessarily that bad, especially if you're mage or shaman, but it's still just not that great. I mean, if he's only a 5/10 taunt for 9 mana, I don't think that's quite enough, right? That's Ancient of War stats, and Ancient of War costs 7 mana. You want to be 5/15 before this guy's really paying off his mana cost, and that means you need to have done some work. You need to play 2 elementals in the previous turn. I think this is a card you don't mind picking up when you've already gotten there with elementals. When you've got a bunch of other elemental stuff going on, and then this guy becomes just an incidental 9 mana 5/15 taunt, right? Then he's just better than the 6/10 taunt Mastodon that you can get. But he's not that much better, right? And even when you have a bunch of elementals, the 6/10 taunt just being a guy that's reliable, that you can play him as a 6/10 taunt anytime for 9 mana, whereas this guy, you have to play him specifically after a turn where you've cast a bunch of elementals. I mean, I don't know, maybe you live the dream and this guy becomes like a 5/20, 5/25, and then he's really good. But even then, I mean, at some point, it's just an absurd amount of health, and if they're getting rid of it with a Hex or a Polymorph or a Sap or whatever anyways, then you're not really having a good time. I don't think this is a card you pick up very highly. Yeah, I think most often you're going to have a legendary offered to you that's better than this, and you're going to take it. Primal Fin Lookout. It's a 3 mana 3/2. Has upside, but only if you have Murlocs. I don't think this is the meta where Murlocs get there. Again, this is part of where there's a difference between Magic the Gathering and Hearthstone. In Magic the Gathering, you could be the Hearthstone deck because everyone at the table, or you could be the Murloc deck because everyone at the table would pass you the Murlocs and you'd get all of them. In Hearthstone, you're choosing between 3 cards. You're just not going to be offered Murlocs all that frequently, and so this guy isn't going to have a lot of upside. If you could guarantee you had another Murloc, this guy would be great, but you're just not going to see enough Murlocs, and they're not going to, most of the Murlocs are pretty bad, so you're not going to want to draft them to make this guy work. Just not a good card. It's a 3 mana 3/2 usually, which is not a good rate. You want your stats to be 3/4, and even then, if it's just a vanilla 3/4, you're not that excited about it. This guy's missing 2 stats, and you're probably not getting any upside. Yeah, pass on this guy. Primordial Drake. This is fantastic, along with the theme of a lot of really good epics in this set, which complements the fact that they've changed the offering rates so that you see epics a lot more often. This guy's a great epic. Dragon is sometimes relevant. The most important thing here is he's a big booty taunt 4/8. 8 is a lot of toughness. Battlecry, deal 2 damage to all other minions. This guy is just an excellent defensive creature, and really makes a very good high cost card to put in any slower deck. Obviously not very good in any sort of aggressive deck because it's all other minions, not all of your opponent's minions. Then this card would just be broken. But so if you have a bunch of stuff that you're beating your opponent in the face with, this card becomes dead in your hand. But yeah, I think you're going to be drafting slower decks more often than not. Whenever you have a slower deck, this is going to be a great card for it. Definitely a tier 1 card. Very strong. Very, very strong. Pick this most of the times that you see it. Pterodax Hatchling. Adapt. Battlecry Adapt. Here's a sort of vanilla adapt card. 3 mana 2/2's bad, but if you remember the adaptations, this guy could become a 3/3. Okay. He could become a 2/5. Okay. He could become a 5/2. Alright. I mean, I guess the trouble here is that this guy, you know, the adaptation stuff is nice, but a 3 mana Frostwolf Grunt, if you give this taunt, is not good. A 3 mana 2/2 Divine Shield, right? He's a what was the mech? There was a 2 mana 2/2 Divine Shield mech that was great, but it cost 2 mana, right? This guy is like a bad Silent Knight, I guess. That's maybe the point of comparison. Or kind of like I'd say a worse version of Scarlet Crusader when you give him Divine Shield. When you give him Poisonous, he's a worse version of Giant Wasp. I guess the trick is here, adaptations, I want to say that you want to consider adaptations as neither a benefit nor a hindrance, right? If that's one way to think about it. Like, you do have the flexibility of what you adapt into, and you're going to be able to pick what's best for this guy. But at the same time, there's RNG in it, in that you're not being offered all 10 of the adaptations. You don't get to just pick and choose. You're only going to be offered 3, and sometimes, in some situations, there's only maybe 1 or 2 of them that you want. You might not be offered them. Like, if you want Poisonous, well, you're only going to get Poisonous as one of your options 30% of the time. So the flexibility offered by Adapt and letting you have that ability to choose what you want and tailor it to the situation, I think that benefit is offset by the RNG of Adapt, that sometimes you're just not going to get good adaptations. And at the end of the day, if the creature itself is overcosted, it's a 3 mana 2/2, right? That becomes, say, a 3 mana 2/5 or Divine Shield 2/2, right? If none of the adaptations make that creature efficient, right, then it isn't a good creature. And I don't think this is a good creature as a result, right? I don't want a 3 mana 2/5 most of the time. I don't want a 3 mana 5/2 most of the time. I don't want a 3 mana 2/2 Divine Shield or 2/2 Taunt or 2/2 Poisonous, really. Like, there's a lot of stuff that just doesn't work here. I don't know. If I gave him 3 mana 2/2 Death Rattle, summon 2 1/1s, he's not that bad. He's like a 4/4 in that case, kind of. You look at him a little bit funny. But there's aren't that many adaptations that make this an efficient creature, and so I'm going to not pick him up most of the time as a result. Ravasaur Runt. 2 mana 2/2, so he costs 1 less than the other guy, and has the battle cry, if you control at least 2 other minions, adapt. So the trick is that you have to have 2 other minions, and then this guy becomes better, right? If this guy is like a 2 mana 5/2, that's pretty good, right? Or he's like, I don't know, maybe a 2 mana 2/2 Wind Fury, something along those lines. If you get the adapt off, he's not bad. But to get that adapt off, you have to be a pretty aggressive deck that's playing a lot of stuff. And I think more often than not, you're going to want to have some way of pretty reliably getting out 2 minions on like turn 1. And the class that's going to be best suited to deal with that, I think, is Paladin. Paladin now has Lost in the Jungle, which is a 1 mana summon 2 1/1 Paladins, or a little like Silverhand Recruit guys. That could be, you play that turn 1 and then you curve out into this guy turn 2, and baby, you got a stew going. But if you don't have some strategy of doing that, then it's tricky, right? Alley Cat is also available if you're able to pick it up, although its offering rate is lower, so a Hunter could work with this. If Druid gets something like Living Roots, I don't recall actually if Living Roots is still in Standard. But you need some effect like that is what I want to stress. And I think the class that's best suited to get it is Paladin, because they have the highest offering rate one mana get two bodies type guy. And in either case, you're going to want to be an aggressive deck because you're going to want to have board control. You're going to be the guy who controls things before you play this, and you're going to want to play this as sort of an aggressive creature and try and kill your opponent with it because if you don't have board control and this guy just becomes a 2-mana 2/2, that's pretty bad. So good in aggressive decks, like maybe a tier 2-ish type card in aggressive decks. Pretty bad tier 3, tier 4 in other decks. This is like a desperation card in decks that don't have that sort of aggressive bent and don't have ways of pumping out creatures. Rockpool Hunter. I would say this guy is basically a 2-mana 2/3. Kind of the same reason why that 3-mana 3/2 guy wasn't good. This guy's okay though because a 2-mana 2/3 is a decent body, whereas a 3-mana 3/2 is not. This guy's fine. Again, I think you're going to rate 2-mana 2/3s over 2-mana 3/2s in this meta, at least until the next set comes out and something changes, because the offering rates are such that there's a lot of 2 damage removal, right? And this guy will survive it, and the 3/2s won't. And as a result, I think you value this guy as like a better version of a Crocolisk usually, because sometimes the battle cry might be relevant, but he's basically just a vanilla 2/3 and you want to treat him as such. Sabertooth Stalker. I think this card is bad. I don't think it's good at all. It's decent in an aggressive deck because it's essentially just 8 points to your opponent's dome if they don't have a taunt creature. But if you aren't going to the dome, then this card is basically just a 6-mana version of Giant Wasp, right? If you're trading with another creature, if you're running this guy into anything that isn't your opponent's face, then this card is just a Giant Wasp that costs twice as much, right? Because Giant Wasp effectively has infinite attack as long as it isn't attacking an opponent's face. This guy is, I don't know, like a removal spell in a sense for 6 mana. I think the reason why this card isn't very good is, in particular, the 2 health is bad. There's a lot of AoE removal that does 2 damage now. Volcanic Potion, Blizzard, the Primordial Drake that we saw, right? There's a lot of stuff that does 2 damage, and the stealth doesn't matter. And, if you're paying 3 mana for a Wasp, that's fine, right? It's only 3 mana that you're losing. When you're playing this guy, turn 6, turn 7, and then your opponent responds by coining out or playing out a Primordial Drake, you have lost the game probably, right? You've lost a lot there. I think this card is not something you ever want to pick up. I'd only consider picking it up if I'm an aggressive deck and this is something I'm doing to try and get more reach for my deck. But I see there being a lot of taunt in this meta. There's a lot of taunt creatures, and a lot of times this guy is just like a bad 6-mana removal spell. So I don't know. I'm not that big on this guy. I wouldn't pick him very highly. Sated Threshodon. This guy's pretty good. 7 mana 5/7, but Death Rattle, summon 3/1/1 Murlocs. Yeah, sure. I mean, you're basically saying this guy is a 7 mana 8/10, but with some of the stats kind of backloaded. That's fine. I mean, it's a beast, so it has that synergy as well. I like this card a lot. I think this is a tier 1 common. I think you're going to pick it up. I mean, the 7 mana cost is high, but I think this is a slower meta. You're going to be fine having a couple 7 mana cards in your deck pretty easily. Yeah, I think this is a card you definitely pick. It's not like they can really ignore this guy, right? They're going to have to deal with him usually. And because 5 attack is a lot. That's something that starts eating the board pretty quickly or starts going face pretty quickly. Puts you on a pretty short clock. But so it's not even just that, like, yeah, some of the stats are backloaded, but they're backloaded on a creature that probably is going to reach its back end sooner rather than later, right? I understand he still has a lot of toughness. He's a 5/7, but 5 attack is at that point where he's clearing a lot of important stuff that you don't want to have cleared, and a lot of opponents are just going to have to deal with him in some way. And, even when they silence him or do something like that, it's not like you've lost a whole lot. You've only lost 3/1/1s, right? A 5/7 for 7 is still not that bad of a rate in and of itself, right? Like 7/7 for 7 is kind of the War Golem standard, which isn't a very good card. I'd say you're looking more for, like, I don't know, like Bog Creeper type stuff, like a 6/8. with Taunt or something like this. This is, you know, not quite meeting that, but it's not that far off either. Basically, just 8-10 for 7 mana is great. So if you don't have part of that right at the start, if you're missing 3/3 of that, it's still an excellent card. Tier 1, I would say. You're gonna draft this more than the other two options almost always. Servant of Kalamos. I think this guy is great in Mage and Shaman. And he's one of the big payoff cards for having a bunch of elementals. In Mage and Shaman in particular, the thing is that Mage and Shaman have legendary elementals, and the offering rates on the Discover, right, are such that it really much more highly values class cards. And so a lot of times you'll play this as a Mage and you'll get Pyros. You'll play this as a Shaman, you'll get Kalamos, right? This is the Servant of Kalamos that summons Kalamos. And Kalamos and Pyros are really, really strong cards. And this guy being able to grab them is pretty good. So this is one of these cards that makes you draft, even if you're not one of the elemental decks, probably makes you draft elementals like Firefly and whatnot to turn this guy on. I think if you're in Mage and Shaman, you're almost, even if you haven't gotten, even if this is just like your first pick of the draft, you're picking this guy because the upside on him is so huge. Being able to get a legendary, like a really good legendary off of the Discover effect is a really big deal. Even if you just play this guy as a vanilla 4/5 for 5, he isn't that bad, right? And it is not that hard to turn on this if you played an elemental last turn clause, right? Especially if you're in one of these decks that has a lot of elemental stuff going on, like Mage and Shaman. And it's an even greater upside when you are Mage and Shaman and the elementals that you're discovering are really fantastic elementals. I think this guy is like slam dunk pick almost always in Mage and Shaman, and he's a card that you probably consider drafting even if you're not one of these elemental classes. If you can get there, this is one of the payoffs. I actually value this guy reasonably highly in non-elemental classes because he'd kind of make me want to pick up more elementals. I don't know. He's obviously tier 1 in Mage and Shaman. He's probably still tier 2, I guess, in other classes. But he's like, I don't know. There's a debate to be had there. But if you're Mage or Shaman, you pick this guy up every time, no matter what, I think. Like, there are very few rares that I'm going to take over this. And yeah, I think that's all there is to it. If you're another class, you really have to make it sort of a judgment call as to whether or not you're really going to be able to turn on this guy. You want to be able to turn him on, and the payoff is not going to be as great if you're not one of these elemental classes because you're not going to get Pyros or Kalamos. But if you're like Priest, right, you could get the legendary elemental for Priest, and that card isn't that bad. And if you're another class, you can still get some pretty useful things, right? You could get just another Servant of Kalamos, right? Which is Enchained Servant of Kalamoses, right? You play Servant of Kalamos one turn, next turn you play the next Servant of Kalamos, and you just keep going off. I don't know. I think this card is very good, though. Must pick in Mage or Shaman. Spirit Singer Umbra. After you summon a minion, trigger its Death Rattle effect. Yeah, I mean, I don't know. In Arena, this is not that great because it's hard to put together those synergies. A 4-mana 3/4 is not really where you want to be. You know, a lot of times you'll play this and you'll have plans on playing a Death Rattle creature next turn, but then, right, your opponent will kill this. So it's a little bit awkward how you sequence this. I just don't think this is a very good card. I'm not going to pick it that highly. I'd want to have some Death Rattles before I said this is the legendary for me. Most often I'm going to see another legendary that I like more. It's just not a great card, I think. Stegodon. I mean, it's a 4-mana 2/6 with Taunt. It's a decent defensive creature, I guess. It's nothing really that exciting, though. Like, this stat line is not that great. Remember, you kind of want to have you want to have the mana cost ×2 + 1 on your stats. This guy is 1 short of that. I mean, I don't know. If you have a slower deck, though, and you want to make sure you're like living to play your higher cost stuff, this is fine. If you rely on beast synergies, this is fine. But this is probably more like a tier 3-ish type card. This is one of these average filler cards you don't really want in your deck, but sometimes you have to pick up because there just aren't other choices for you. Stonehill Defender. I think this guy's pretty good. Three mana 1/4 is not really that exciting. That in fact, it's really unexciting. It's not good stats basically. This is Ancient of not Ancient of War. What am I talking? Ancient Silverback Patriarch. The guy's so irrelevant. I forgot his name. Um, but Battlecry Discover a taunt minion is a pretty big deal. There are a lot of really good taunt minions. For example, Primordial Drake. You could grab a Primordial Drake. That card's fantastic, right? There's a lot of really good taunt minions that have been introduced by this set in particular. And I think because of that, this card goes up a lot in value. You're going to be drawing a card off of this guy's Enter the Battlefield, basically his Battle Cry, and that card is going to be probably better than most of the cards that you have in your deck. So that's a really strong effect. Anything that basically reads like draw a card as it enters the battlefield can shave a lot off of its stats and still be good, right? Gnomish Inventor at 4 mana for a 2/4 is still a decent card, and you're going to pick it a decent number of times in Arena. You're losing one stat, one attack stat, right? But you're gaining taunt, and you're probably doing something better than drawing a card. I think this guy's really good. I think this is a very, very top tier rare, probably tier 1 by my definition, which I see the previous video. And by some other people's definitions, I guess, of the tiers, they'd say tier 2, but according to mine, this is a tier 1 card. I'm going to pick this. I'm going to put this in my deck most times that I see it. I really do think the Battlecry Discover a Taunt minion is better than drawing a card in Arena at the moment. Like, not hugely better, but better. And if you have a 3 mana card that draws a card or better than draws a card when it enters the battlefield, yeah, I don't mind if it's a 1/4. That's fine. Stormwatcher. So it's Wind Fury Harpy, but for 1 mana you got 3 extra toughness. That's actually not that bad. I don't want this guy in my deck, even though I think the elementals thing is pretty strong. Typically you want like cheaper elementals. You also just want like elementals that are fine on their own. This guy's fine though. I mean, I don't know, tier 3, tier 4, something like that by my tier definitions. You don't really want him, but you'll be kind of okay with him. You'll be a lot more okay with this guy than you would be Wind Fury Harpy, right? Because paying 1 extra mana for 3 extra stats is a good deal. And I think having the extra health is a really big deal, given that it is Wind Fury, because that means that you can kill off 2 creatures with this. You can trade this in for 2 things. It's also much more likely to survive to your next turn, so the Wind Fury becomes relevant. Whereas, you know, a big thing that would happen to Wind Fury Harpy is you'd play it for 6 mana, and they just say, okay, here's my 5/5 that I cast the turn earlier. I'm just going to kill your guy, right? And the Wind Fury was just completely irrelevant. It's like you played a 6 mana vanilla 4/5, right? You played a 6 mana Chillwind Yeti. I still don't want to draft this guy. I'm hoping I have better options than him whenever I'm picking an Arena. But sometimes you'll be stuck with this guy, and he'll be less bad than Wind Fury Harpy, I guess. But still don't want him a lot. Stubborn Gastropod. The guys at Grinning Goat think this is fantastic. They're like, this is the best common in the set. I disagree. I think there's a lot of removal that does 2 damage, and this guy dies to all of it. Right? If you play this on turn 8, your opponent plays Primordial Drake, and it dies. Right? You play this earlier on, and he plays, some mage spell that does 2 damage for 2 mana. There's a lot of answers to this. I think that stealth is a much better keyword than taunt when it comes to this poisonous stuff. And so you kind of have some problems with this guy. That said, it still is a very good creature, right? I mean, you can imagine this as like for defensive purposes, it's a 2 mana, I don't know, 5/2, 6/2, 10/2, 22 creature, right? With taunt for 2 mana. That's fantastic. You can play this just straight up as basically like a 3/2 for 2 mana, right? And your opponent's 2/3 trades into it. This is, at worst, right, a 2 mana creature that trades with all the other 2 mana creatures and doesn't let them like get around it either, right? So you play this down, and it's not like they go, oh, well, it only has 1 attack, so I'll hit their face, and then they'll hit my face, and I'll still be ahead. No, it has taunt, right? Still, I mean, again, there's a lot of stuff that answers this, right? There's a lot of stuff that deals 2 damage in this format. You play this, and they play the 3/3 for 4 mana guy, the Flame Wake. I don't know, whatever, the elemental that the 3/3 for 4 deals 2 damage. They play that on turn 4. They play the Primordial Drake on turn 8. They play a removal spell on turn 2. There's so much stuff they can do to get rid of this that I'm not going to say this is the best common in the set. I think they're over evaluating this by a pretty good margin, but it's still very good. This is still tier 1. You're still going to want it in your deck. You're going to pick it. Like, most of the time that you see this is going to be your best option. I just don't think it's the best common in the set. I just want to say that. But still very strong. Again, it's a good 2-drop. It's one of the best 2-drops because it trades with every other 2-drop. It trades with 3-drops and 4-drops, right? Your opponent needs to have a small removal to answer this very well. There are going to be some situations where this guy really does a lot of work, right? Where your opponent only has, a giant Mastodon out. You play Stubborn Gastropod. You're both in top deck mode. They top deck something that isn't an answer to this creature, and they don't have a way through it. And you trade off your 2-mana guy for their 9-mana guy, and you go back to top deck racing, right? Like, this card is going to get some pretty good upside. And I think at its minimum, it's still just one of the best 2-drops. So, yeah, I think it's good. I think it's tier 1. I just don't think it's the best. There's so many cards that answer this efficiently that I don't think you can call this the best common in the set. Tar Creeper. Now, this is also in the running. This is also in the running for best common in the set. This is a very defensive creature, but it's Ascension Shieldmaster for 3 mana on your opponent's turn. Like, on defense, it is Ascension Shieldmaster. It's also an elemental, so it has special relevance there. Obviously, this isn't a very aggressive creature. It only has 1 attack on your turn. It also gets silenced pretty badly, I guess. But, yeah, a 3/5 taunt is what this is usually going to be for 3 mana. And that's a very good creature. This is fantastic. Tier 1. You'll draft it in pretty much everything. Again, even if you're an aggressive deck, a lot of times you're gonna grab taunt minions like this because they force your opponent to get through this taunt minion before they can kill off the creatures that are killing them, right? So it's not like, right? This is one of these cards that in some way alleviates you from having to make trades and trade off the board, and instead lets you go face, right? So in a tempo play, this guy is still a lot of good stats for 3 mana, and it's going to screw with your opponent's ability to stop you from going face against them. And if you have some reach or some other stuff in your deck, right, you get enough hits with your early creatures, and by the time they're able to clear this and then clear those creatures, they're within range of your reach, and you win the game, turn 7, turn 8, turn 6, whatever, because of cards like this. So I like this card a lot. I think he's fantastic. I think almost always you pick this guy up. Yeah, regardless of what your other choices are. The Vorax. This card is bad. It has some relevance, I guess, in Paladin, where you have a lot of creature buffs. But even then, I'd rather just take something that's more reliably good. A 4-mana 3/3 is pretty bad. Like, let's say I have, I don't know, like Mark of the Wild or something. I cast Mark of the Wild on the Vorax. Well, part of the problem is I'm getting a 3/3 plant with, I guess, taunt, right? But is that enough to really make up for the fact that this guy only had 3/3 worth of stats for 4 mana in the first place, right? If this guy was a 5/5 for 4, he'd be pretty good. But that's really the line that if he was like a 4/5 for 4, he'd be okay. I'm getting like an extra 3/3 in stats when I cast that buff, but that's like I'm not really that far ahead of breaking even, right? Like, even when I have a synergy with this card, even when I'm playing a buff card, I'm only kind of getting a little bit ahead. And a lot of times you're just not going to have a buff card for this. A lot of classes in particular just don't have any buff cards for this. You have to be a class that has buff cards that it can play on this stuff, that actually matter. It can't just be like you play Blessing of Wisdom, because then, right, they kill off your plant token before it gets to attack. I don't know. I think this is more of a constructed card. I don't think this is something you pick up very highly in under any situation. It's just too hard to put together the synergies that are necessary for this card. You'd really have to have gone in on a lot of other stuff to make this card work, and you wouldn't pick this card and build around it, right? It would be like you incidentally happened to have built around it and then you got offered it. That's not going to happen very often. Not a good card. Thunder Lizard. This card's interesting. Battlecry, if you played an elemental last turn, adapt. We saw the beast that cost 3, but it was a 2/2 that had adapt, and I didn't think that was that good. This is a 3/3 for 3 with adapt. I think this is actually decent. Again, you really have to have done stuff with elementals, though, so this is a card that's probably much more relevant to Mage and Shaman, where I think the elemental strategy really makes a lot of sense, and it's less relevant to the other classes. I don't know. It's still pretty decent, though. If I get a 3-mana 3/6, this card is fine. If I get a 3-mana 6/3, this card is okay. If I get a 3-mana 3/3 Taunt, If I get a 3-mana 3/3 Divine Shield, that's good. You know, most of the rates are pretty decent for this guy. And it's really just a question of, do you have enough elementals? And I'd really only feel comfortable drafting this guy really early if I was one of the elemental classes where I was pretty sure I was just going to be trying to pick up as many elementals as I could regardless. He is also notably not an elemental himself, which is one of the things that's kind of tricky because most of the other elemental payoff cards are also elementals. So you have this ability where you play an elemental on turn 3, like the tar guy, right? Then you play your 4 cost triggers by elemental thing, and that guy's also an elemental, and then he triggers your 5 drop, then he triggers your 6 drop, and then your 7 drop, right? This guy breaks the chain by not being an elemental himself, and that's kind of disadvantageous. I think this card is fair, though. I think this is like a tier 2-ish card when you're in one of those strategies. It's probably like tier 3-ish. I mean, a 3-mana 3/3 can only be so bad, right? Like, even if he's just a vanilla 3-mana 3/3 beast, there's some guys who are going to be like, all right, well, I guess this is the best choice, right? Because they're not going to have other better options available to them. But I don't know. I think this card is okay in one of the classes that gets there with elementals. I think he's a vanilla 3/3 most of the other time, but I'm actually going to draft this guy a decent amount of the time, right? I'm actually going to pick this guy a decent amount of the time because I have to imagine there are going to be situations where I just don't have better options, right? And this guy is not that bad, especially if you got there with elementals, right? Like, if he's a 3-mana 3/6, that's great. If he's a 3-mana 3/3 Divine Shield, that's great, right? There's a lot of adaptations that give this guy an above average rate. Like, Taunt might not get there, but if he Death Rattle summons 2 1/1s, or he's a 4/4, right? Even if he's a 6/3, I'm kind of fine with that. Yeah, I think that's enough upside that I'm gonna pick this guy a decent number of times. Tol'vir Stoneshaper. Now this guy's better than the last one. Right off the bat, 4-mana 3/5. I actually like a little bit better than a 3-mana 3/3. But Battlecry, if you played an elemental last turn, gained Taunt and Divine Shield. I mean, if you consider the last guy, right? This was Battlecry if you played an elemental last turn, adapt. This guy is kind of like he's giving you 2 adaptations, Taunt and Divine Shield. That's a lot of payoff, right? Like, the stat line hasn't changed that much. 1 extra mana, you're getting 2 extra toughness on this guy, but you're getting an extra adaptation, basically, straight out the gate. I think this card is better than the last one. I draft it more highly. I think this is like tier 1 material when you're in one of these elemental classes. Yeah, I like this guy a lot better than Thunder Lizard. And same caveats apply. You need to have some elemental stuff going on, but if you do have the elemental stuff going on, then this guy is good, really good. And even when you don't get there with the elementals, 3/5 for 4 isn't the worst. I like that stat line a little bit better than 3/3 for 3. Some people don't, but I'm a little bit more comfortable with that stat line as just a vanilla minion. And I think the payoff is better, right? It's the equivalent of like 2 adaptations. So I like this guy a lot. Tortallin Primalist. I've seen a lot of guys rate this very highly. I drafted him. He's an 8-mana 5/4, which is not that great. You really, you need to get there with the Discover. Like, there are a lot of bad spells out there, let me tell you. There are a lot of bad spells, or spells that aren't good things to pick when the target's being chosen randomly. Like, Lightning Bolt is a good spell, but if you're casting it randomly, what does that do, right? Like, does this guy Lightning Bolt himself? Did you just play an 8-mana 5/1? Right? That's not very good. You wanna get like Flame Strike or Sprint or something along those lines, right? But I don't know. I want to play around with this guy more. Maybe I've just gotten unlucky. The cases where I've played him, he was horrible, and so I've knocked this guy down a number of pegs. This guy just, the variance seems so huge. You need to find a worthwhile spell that doesn't target anything, right? That just draws you cards, right? That just AoEs your opponent's board, that does something like that, or does like buffs and only an allied creature. I don't know. Like you need something, and this guy just doesn't always get there. So I'm not super big on him. Like if I play this guy and he then volcanoes the board, like okay, he's like a volcano. I don't know about that. So I'm not big on this guy. A lot of other people are, but there are a lot of epics that I'd rather take over this guy. Again, like he's better than the bad epics that we had before, but compared to the other epics in this set, I just don't think this guy is very good. Ultrasaur. The art on this is a little freaky. Is there some weird depth perception thing going on? I don't know. He looks kind of friendly. He's like, I don't know. Anyways, he's a 10 mana 7/14. Just a pretty ridiculous stat line. I like 7/14. I mean, don't get me wrong. Like, I like having a lot of toughness on these guys, but he doesn't have taunt. He doesn't stabilize you. He costs 10 mana. I mean, I don't know. I think this is the same story of like your 10 mana 10/10s. You just don't really get to play them all that often, right? You need to answer the things that your opponent is doing. Taunt is one of those ways of potentially answering it. This guy does not stabilize you. I don't think this guy's very good. I think you want to pass on him most of the time. It's a lot of mana, and he doesn't impact the board when he comes into play. He doesn't stabilize you. He doesn't have taunt, right? So he's not like stopping your opponent from just killing you. He's just a big, fat, dumb guy. Yeah, I'll pass. Vicious Fledgling. This card's great, primarily because one of the adaptations is Wind Fury. After this minion attacks a hero, adapt. Well, great. My first adaptation that I want to pick is Wind Fury, and then guess what I'm going to do? I'm going to attack you again. And then I'm going to give this guy +3 health, and then I'm going to attack you, and I'm going to give him +3 attack, and then suddenly he's a 6/6 Wind Fury, and this is like on turn 4, and I got to hit you for what? I played this guy, I hit you for 3, I hit you for 3 again, and then next turn I hit you for 3, hit you for 6, right? This guy is almost like the poster child for tempo deck, right? This is the guy that'll close out games very quickly against the slower decks. If they aren't contesting the board early on, if you're able to just, they play something, you clear it, they play something, you clear it, and you leave this guy free and clear to do what he wants, he will mess them up. This is a guy who demands an answer. And the 3 health stat line, you know, in older times, there would have been a lot more 3 damage removal relative to 2 damage removal. Now there's just a lot of 2 damage removal, and it's kind of awkward getting rid of this guy sometimes, right? You kind of need to have like a removal spell plus something. You can't just play your 3/3 elemental that deals 2 damage to a target and go, okay, job done. This guy attacks again, and one of the adaptations is gain 3 health. If this guy is gaining 3 health, it's hard to deal with him. He can run away with games. I value this card very highly in any tempo aggressive deck, right? He's less good in a deck where you're not contesting the board early because he does need to be able to attack the opponent, right? That's sometimes tricky. If this guy you play him and then he dies to your opponent's minions the turn after, he isn't that good. But in the right deck, this guy is just a savage beating. Tier 1 easily. And in the slower decks, it's still sometimes, you know, you play this guy and your opponent doesn't have an answer and you go, oh great, I just win the game. It happens a lot less often than when you're in the aggressive decks, but still, cards that demand answers, that your opponent has to do something about them, or they carry away the game, like that only cost 3 mana, you know, you're going to play a bunch of games in your arena run. If this guy picks up even just like 1 or 2 games for you, he's paid for himself, right? Like, he doesn't need to be the guy who wins the game every time. You're only investing 3 mana into him, but enough games will happen where this guy just wins you the game that I think he's tier 1. You pick this guy up. You only really consider not picking this guy up if you're a very slow deck, if you don't have, you know, any way of really getting the board and protecting this guy. But again, a lot of your taunt stuff that I talked about earlier, right? We had the Tar Elemental, the 3/5 taunt, but only on your turn, or only on your opponent's turn does he have 3 attack, right? This is the guy that hides behind the taunts, and there's a lot of taunts here, and gets a lot of work done. He also is the guy that needs you to clear the taunts out from in front of him before he does his work. So there is that challenge, but it's not like this format having so much taunt diminishes this guy too much, because the taunts also protect him, right? And if you have some removal, if you can clear away your opponent's taunts, and if you can do that sort of tempo strategy, this guy can carry a lot of games. So I value this card very highly. I think it's a very savage beating. I think you're going to play a lot of games where you just lose to this guy because you just didn't happen to have an answer to him right away. You're going to win some games because your opponent just didn't have an answer to this guy right away. And basically, first time you attack an enemy with this guy, first time you attack an enemy hero, I should say, the adaptation you want to see is Wind Fury. You get Wind Fury, you probably win the game. You give this guy, when he attacks and then he becomes a 3/6 Wind Fury, and your opponent's like, wow, it's like, I had trouble answering him when he was a 3/3. Now I need to answer him when he's a 3/6, right? Like, that's problematic. And again, there's a lot of 2 damage removal. That removal is not very good against this guy, because if you say, okay, well, I'll do 2 damage to him this turn, and the next turn I'll ping him for the final point, if he gets the health, or he gets +1/+1, or +0/+3, or he gets Divine Shield, or he gets Stealth, right? The list goes on. This guy becomes, like, really, really a pain to deal with. Very great card. Very underrated by a lot of the other people who have rated the set, I think. I think this card is great. Volatile Elemental. Great defensive creature. This is sort of a great example of a creature that gets relevance even when you don't control the board. In fact, this is a creature that gets relevance especially when you don't control the board, because the Death Rattle is really only relevant when your opponent has creatures left around for it to kill. It's an elemental, which is really important to the elemental strategies. I think this guy is, even if you're not into elementals, if you're not one of those classes, he's a great defensive creature. I mean, this is a 2-drop that you'll play like you won't even necessarily play it on turn 2, but if you're on the draw, you might play this turn 2. And he does so much work. I mean, 3 damage to a random enemy minion is big game, right? Like, that's, if you want to think about it another way, this guy is kind of like a Flame Cannon, right? Flame Cannon was 4 damage to a random enemy minion. This guy is 3 damage to a random enemy minion, but you also get like this 1/1 body. He's also an elemental. I mean, I don't know. I think this card is very good. I think this is tier 1 for pretty much everybody, and for the elemental guys, it's even higher. Maybe in some decks, if you're like an aggressive deck, this guy is tier 2, because your opponent oftentimes is like, if you're a very aggressive deck and you're clearing your opponent's board and going face and clearing board and going face, this guy isn't relevant, because your opponent's going to take one of those opportunities when his board is clear, which you're doing for him because you don't want him to get off advantageous trades. And he'll just ping this guy, right? He'll hit it with his weapon, or he'll ping it with, his mage power, he'll do whatever, and then this guy's dead, right? And didn't do any work. So not as great in an aggressive strategy, but in any slower strategy, of which I think there are going to be a lot of, like, I think the meta's slowed down quite a lot. I think this guy's going to be good. And any strategy that cares about elementals is going to like this guy as well. Volcanosaur. This guy's great. Big, fat fatty. You get to adapt twice, which in some cases I think just sort of reduces the variance on the adaptations. Yeah, you might get one bad one, but if you get one good one, like if you get +3 health, imagine this guy just adapted once, but it was always +3 health, and he was a 5/9 for 7 mana. That isn't that bad, right? I mean, I would pick up things like, I don't know. I would pick up a 7/8 for 7 mana pretty easily. And if this is a 5/9, it's not that much worse, because a lot of times you're just cleaning up small stuff. This gets another adaptation on top of that. This could be a 5/9 taunt, right? That's not that far off from Bog Creeper. Bog Creeper is a 6/8 taunt for 7 mana. Sometimes what you'll do is you'll give this guy like +3 attack or Wind Fury and Stealth. And then you just deal 8 to 10 damage to your opponent the next turn, and he doesn't have a good way of interacting with it. That's pretty messed up. You give this guy, let's say, +1/+1, and then Death Rattle, summon 2 1/1s, right? He becomes a 6/7 for 7 that summons 2 1/1s when he dies. That's not bad. I mean, it's not like it's Dr. Boom or anything, but it's good, right? Most of the adaptations at this stat line get him there, I feel. You know, you play this guy and you give him Divine Shield. You play this guy and you give him Taunt and extra health. You give this guy just +1/+1 in almost anything, right? If this guy is a... Remember we saw that 7 mana 4/8 Wind Fury? This guy could pretty easily be a 7 mana 6/7 Wind Fury, right? Which I think is just a lot better. Card is good. I'm not going to say it's like tier 1, maybe it's borderline tier 1, tier 2, but it's not that... If it's not in tier 1, it's not that far off from tier 1. Solid card. And that's it for the neutrals. Went through them in alphabetical order, I believe. I think overall, the thing to kind of take into account is there's a lot of slower defensive stuff going on, right? Just to kind of go back to the beginning and then look through some of them. There's a lot of taunt. There's a lot of value creatures, right? There aren't a lot of aggressive things. This guy's aggressive, but this one is like an elemental synergy type thing. Here, this is a value card, right? Draw a card when it enters the battlefield, basically. This is, you know, a board clear card. This is a card that helps you when you're not on the board, right? It's a card for killing off your opponent's creatures and trading off board. Screw that one. This guy's a death rattle creature, right? He's a sticky minion. He's there to help you establish that board presence when your opponent owns the board. Here's a value card, right? Shuffle a 2 mana draw 5 into your deck. This guy, removal, more board trading. This guy, more removal, essentially, right? Big taunt guys. Ways of clearing stuff, right? Like more removal, effectively, is what this is. Anti-weapon type stuff. This guy's better in the late game because then he can get rid of all your low-cost stuff. Death rattle stuff. Big booty taunts, right? 7 toughness type guys. You see a lot of stat lines like this, right? Where they have a lot of toughness relative to their attack. Kind of the same story with this guy, but he's just not that good. Primordial Drake, really great defensive creature. So I think like there's a lot of stuff in this format that like this. There's a lot of stuff in this format that's built around getting value, right? Discovering cards when they come into play, drawing cards when they come into play, lots of taunts, lots of stat lines with more defense than offense. Like this card might be the poster child for what a lot of this meta looks like, I think. 2/6 taunt for 4. That's the Chillwind Yeti of this set, it feels like. Guys like this. Guys like this. Guys like this, especially. Guys like this, taunt and divine shield. Even the big fatties are 7/14s. They're not 10/10s. This guy's pretty aggressive, but this guy's defensive. And this guy can be pretty defensive as well. So I don't know. I think there's a lot of taunt. There's a lot of small removal. There's a lot of card advantage and value. And I think you're going to see a slower meta as a result of this. In next video, I'll go over, well, in the subsequent videos, I'll go over each class and the card specific to them. And I'll discuss sort of where I think the class goes in particular. It's hard to discuss meta things like, should you be playing mages as more controlling mages or more tempo mages, or like how is that working out? It's difficult to do that just looking over the neutral set. But I think the overall arching message of the neutral set, a neutral part of the set, is it's a slower meta. It's more value than it is curve, right? It's more about card advantage than out-tempoing your opponent. And there's a lot of taunt. There's a lot of small guys that generate value, that draw you cards, right? The 3/4, the 3 mana 1/4 taunt that discovers a taunt for you, that sort of thing. And I think more often than not, you're going to want to play a more value-y type game, as it was back in the early days of Hearthstone, as compared to, you know, where we were a year ago, where it was just all creatures, no spells. The guy who had board control got to dictate all the trades, and because he got to dictate all the trades, he just generated advantage every turn and then won the game. This is going to be more. This is going to be a more thoughtful game, I feel, right? And it's going to allow, because the offering rates have changed, I think it'll allow a little bit more for skill. It'll kind of get rid of some of the problems that we've seen in past iterations of Arena, where skill, I think, mattered a little bit less, either because you didn't get to make a lot of consequential decisions during your Arena draft, or your plays were all dictated by whatever was the highest tempo play, for example. Yeah, I think this is going to be a more value-based format for us. That's kind of my thesis going in, and that's sort of what I've seen in the drafts that I've done, or in the arenas that I've run. And yeah, I think this neutral set shows it off pretty well. All right, see you next video.